Time for yet another confession. Greetings, my name is Nina. Welcome back to my channel. Fact about me, I used to like dystopian genre. However, my view of the dystopian genre has changed. To be fair, there were things about the dystopian genre that I didn't like that I noticed back then. When the dystopian genre was still in my favor, that was in the late 2010s, no, around the 2017, 19, yeah, kind of like that. Even back then, there were things that I noticed about the dystopian genre that I didn't really like, and I'm gonna address them here in the video, but nonetheless, I liked dystopian genre all the same. Now I see things differently. There are a lot of things that I noticed about the dystopian genre, especially the way people see dystopia. So I have my journal. This is actually for everything, but this is where I wrote my thoughts about the dystopian genre. Just look at those stickers. They fit this turquoise journal very well. It's a moleskin. So let's get started. So I read my very first dystopian novel back in December 2015. Before that, I heard a lot about dystopias. I've heard of Fahrenheit 451, and that was my first classic dystopia. Back then, I thought it was a must-read for everybody. However, my view of the book is different, and while I still have the book, then I read 1984 and Brave New World, both in 2017, first in January and the second in October, I think. 1984, the third part of it, managed to frighten me pretty much. And in 2019, there was The Handmaid's Tale. Yeah, I read all 4 must-read classic dystopias. The only classic dystopia that I haven't read was We by Zamyatin. Now when I think about it, I should have read this book back when I was into dystopia. Sure, I can read the book now, but my perception wouldn't be the same. Well, one thing I really liked about the dystopian genre was the world building, the setting, how the world worked. What if there was this society with these social norms and laws, etc.? That was the most interesting part for me. And to an extent, this is the most interesting part to me to this day. Ironically, that was later the reason I was later dissatisfied with dystopia. Sure, I'm not going to talk bad about these books. They have their place in the world. There's a reason why they became popular and must-reads. There is one specific reason these books became popular, so let's analyze that reason. So each of these books came out when society was dealing with certain issues. Well, for example, 1984 was a post-war book, and it was also the beginning of the Cold War. So these books were a compilation of society's biggest fears, and they hit the right dots. Yeah, you heard that right. These books tackled all the problems, and they hit the right dots, and they touched the nerve of a lot of readers. It needs to be said that the aim of those books wasn't simply to scare people like some horror books. Well, Margaret Atwood, the author of The Handmaid's Tale, said that The Handmaid's Tale was a speculative fiction. aka the author wanted to speculate rather than scare somebody. The dystopian genre, well, each of these books, they serve more as a warning. Basically, the message of all of these books is, here are all the horrible things that can happen in society, don't let them happen. The whole plot of these books, especially 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale, especially those, is basically this. Society sucks, government is oppressive, and the main character suffers. Yeah, these are the things that happen, don't let them happen in real life. There's something like that. The message is clear. Okay, we got why these books, they got big. Here is one problem with dystopian books, at least for me. Like I said, even back then I noticed that these books focused on the world a lot. Okay, I do understand that in dystopian fiction you need to come up with specific type of society and world building, etc. in order to scare. Oh, sorry, I wanted to say to warn. I'm gonna be honest with you. If you forget about the external factors, aka the way people perceive these books, wow, this is about things that are happening in real life or whatever, plot-wise and character-wise and story-wise, these books aren't necessarily the strongest. So the authors focus on the oppressive society so much that they didn't write the characters well, and the struggle after you read the books again, after all the emotions and things, when you read these books again, well, their struggle, it kind of feels artificial, and the characterization feels a bit bland. Sure, I noticed that the world building was everything back then, and only recently I noticed that the characterization suffered because of it. Because the characters in these stories, they aren't characters, they are tools. It is kinda justified to some extent, but still. And also it needs to be said that even though the authors were inspired by events happening in real life, as much as they wanted to be simply speculative, they took the scary approach and went too far with it. Finished result is way too grotesque and exaggerated. Yeah, this is more of a shock content, I'd say. Yeah, I understand that this is one of the reasons these books, they became popular, but back then, when these books were written, people did not talk about politics like they do now, and these books kinda served to them as political education, kinda. The way people understand politics now is too different. And I have a controversial take that if these books were released today, I don't think that they would have been this popular like they were when they were released back in the day. There are lots of reasons for that. And now here is one important question to ask about dystopias. Did they age well? The answer to this question depends on a perspective, depends on which perspective you're taking. From the perspective of world news, these books, aged well. And I'm not going to say more about the news because you do not need me to explain how news are. But when news happen, people tend to say, it's like 1984 and it's like The Handmaid's Tale. From such perspective, the books aged well. From the perspective of someone who has political education or is more or less familiar with basic politology, that's me. For those who don't know, I have 2 degrees in international relations. I have political education. From such perspective, these books did not age that well. When you learn a basic politology, when you see how systems work and why some succeed while others fail, you are going to see that the systems built in these books, they wouldn't last in a long run. In real life, such systems, they wouldn't last for too long. Ironically, there are hints to that in 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale. At the very end of those books, there are hints that such regimes are no more. And such systems wouldn't work not for one reason, but a multitude of those. And when various small reasons they come together, there are a lot of factors preventing such systems from working. They fail. So I read these books when I was still at university studying international relations, but my perspective of these books was different from what it is right now. Back then, I took everything written in these books for granted. They showed me these societies, and yeah, they were like, ooh, these horrible societies, they're so scary, kind of like that. My perception was more surface level back then, ironically, and a lot of things that I'm saying here, well, except for the world building part, I only understood recently. Okay, I do recognize that these books, they served as political education for a lot of people. However, I also have an unpopular opinion. If people learned basic politology in schools, such books they wouldn't be very popular. For the main part, because people would have understood how these things work. Well, mostly because they would have noticed the grotesque nature of these books. You know what what physical item I associate with dystopian novels, especially The Handmaid's Tale, given Margaret Atwood's words? I associate these books with a blanket which was made of various fabrics. So you basically take random fabrics and you put them together and you get a really odd blanket. It's one piece is wool, the other is silk, you name it. And these things are put together and you get one really odd blanket out of it. Yeah, this is how I see it. I mean that these authors, they took all the negative stuff happening in the world and they made books based off it. But here is one thing that these books, they wouldn't show you. Well, mostly because these books are written from the perspective of an average individual, and even if they are of a higher status, they aren't the elite anyway. So the main characters in these books are basically cameras. They show you, in these books you would not see the analysis of factors that led to such regimes in the first place. They show you these regimes post factum. I do think that basic politology should be included in schools, and these books actually could be included in the curriculum. These books still can be read anytime, anywhere in the world. These books could be read not necessarily as political education, but to show people what to avoid. Although nearly all aspects of these books, they need to be explained. There should be context, of course. But let's forget the external factors like society, governments, etc. Let's put them all aside. Now let's take the perspective of the regular reader. Did these books age well from the perspective of a reader? Yeah, this is a very good question. What is left if you strip all the politics and speculations and everything from these books? What is left? Then 1984 is basically a love story. So you have these governmental official or something like that, and then you have another person from said party, and they meet, their love is forbidden, blah 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 blah, and spoiler alert, they get caught. Yeah, 1984 is basically a love story if you think about it, and that I noticed back in 2017. And surprisingly, Fahrenheit 451 has a good character development. From another perspective, this is a story of a guy who changes his ways. Brave New World is about a noble hero trying to resist this artificial world. And The Handmaid's Tale is actually a pretty messy book from the perspective of the reader. The main character isn't very interesting, she is basically a camera. Well, the protagonists of dystopian books, they tend to be walking cameras, but the main character in The Handmaid's Tale especially feels like this. And to be honest with you, from the perspective of the reader, these books are okay. From the perspective of the reader, these books, they feel okay. Yeah, dystopian novels aren't simply casual books like a lot of other books are. In these books, you do not get characters simply doing things, and these books, they also feel dry. Yeah, shock content, it works for a while, but then you read these books again and you are like, yeah, whatever. So yeah, for me, dystopian novels were a great read at the moment. So when I started making YouTube videos, I included 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale as my favorite books. But as time went on, my mind shifted to other books, and dystopian novels, they started losing their relevance to me. I do not think of reading them anymore. For me, a good dystopia has either to show the bigger picture, how these systems came to be, etc., or how they are about to fall, kind of like that, or they have to try to show characters doing things. Classic dystopias, while fair for their day, they do not do that. They do neither of these things. Surprisingly, there is one dystopia book, or to be exact, dystopian book series that does the latter, aka it has the character doing things, and the series is of course the Hunger Games. Yeah, now classic dystopian novels, they feel more like spooky tales rather than anything else, especially education. Do I recommend you dystopian fiction, either as political education or simply fiction? Yeah, when you start reading books, yes, I would recommend reading these books at the beginning, because later you wouldn't be into them that much. As a source of education, I'm torn on this. I'm not sure whether I should do that. On one hand, the horrifying events described in these books, they didn't come from thin air. The writers, they knew what they were doing. But on the other hand, these books, they do not explain how things came to be in the first place. And after basic politology, you are going to see how effective this would be in real life. Yeah, to be honest, the dystopian fiction isn't the best type of fiction to learn from. Well, some things yes, but not much. You know what? Here comes the most ironic part. I think you would learn more from reading fantasy than from reading dystopia. I learned much more from reading A Song of Ice and Fire. I learned more from Harry Potter, Mistborn definitely, and The Hunger Games. And also two non-fiction novels, Sapiens and The Humankind, A Hopeful History. I learned more from these than from the dystopian fiction, and now when I think about it, it's better to read fantasy than dystopia. And you know what? I'm going to make a video about fantasy being better than dystopia to understand the world, but... And now actually I see a huge irony in one thing. People say something like, young adult dystopia sucks, or read the classic dystopia. Yet the Hunger Games worked, whereas classic dystopia might be donated to the library. So I read The Hunger Games in December 2024, and by that time I already had a big literature baggage. Yeah, the second book is a bit underwhelming, but in general these books are very good. They do everything just so well, and everything is so subtle, and one thing I like about this book is that it features characters actually doing things. You could talk a lot about The Hunger Games. Eventually, one thing that The Hunger Games definitely is about, at least the first one, is about this girl trying to survive the deadly Hunger Games. And that's the very first thing that you can say about this book. Okay, I'm not going to defend the world building of the Hunger Games here. It can be argued whether it works in real life or not, but here is one huge difference between the Hunger Games and the classic dystopias. In the classic dystopias, world building is everything, and this is why the validity of the regimes, they kind of have to be questioned. Whereas in the Hunger Games, you have a main character simply doing things, and everything is subtle. In the Hunger Games, the world building is more like a playground in which the character does things, and in the Hunger Games, if there are inconsistencies or whatever, I can forgive the lack of explaining why things happened, because the consequences are shown very well. And the classic dystopias, they do neither of these things. One honorable mention, The Giver. The Giver is a dystopia written for kids. However, when I read it, I did not think that it was way too kid-friendly or something like that. And unlike the classic dystopias, this one is more character-driven. I'd say that The Giver is about this boy trying to navigate this world after discovering the shocking truth. It's more about him rather than the world building. I really do not like using the term grow out of something. However, in the case of classic dystopias, I feel like I would use that term because now and I feel like dystopian novels are more like spooky tales. I really do not want to read dystopia that much anymore, so I bought the English versions of 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale. I read The Handmaid's Tale in English, and I tried reading 1984, however, it was way too difficult for me. I donated the book, and I might donate the English version of The Handmaid's Tale too. Yeah, when I say I might donate dystopian novels, I would keep The Handmaid's Tale for a while, but only the Russian version. It does not excite me anymore, it does not offer me much anymore. It was good for its time, but not anymore. Now, I'm not saying that I won't read dystopia again, because dystopia is still a very interesting genre, and there's so much that you could do with it. And you do not have to write about the oppressive government. You could write about the existential crisis in a dystopian setting. You could write about friendship in a dystopian setting. You could write about a character going insane. You could come up with anything, even though I claim that dystopian books, they do not explain these regimes that much. They do not give you the full picture. Dystopian novels, they do not need to be about that, because there can be other things too. And the biggest irony is that such dystopias would be much more interesting and thought-provoking than the classic dystopias that simply scare you. They are speculative, yes, they are warning, but they still feel like spooky tales. So yeah, Margaret Atwood said that that everything that happened in The Handmaid's Tale happened somewhere in the world. In 2019, I was like, yeah, it's horrifying, but the book still sounds interesting. And in 2026, I'm like, yeah, she took all the bad stuff happening in the world and deprived it of a context, or at least altered the context. And while that usually is fine with fiction, that's absolutely fine to get influenced by real life and to change the context, while that's absolutely okay. In this case, everything could have been done much better, I think. And one more thing, I always advocate for artistic license in any type of work. I always advocate for artistic license, and dystopian novels are kinda a result of artistic license. Yeah, I'm always on the side of such things. But artistic license aside, you still need to make everything convincing, I think. And the only dystopia I want to keep on my shelves now when I think about it is Brave New World. I actually want to read it, Brave New World. The last time I read the book was in 2021. And Brave New World is the most heavy metal dystopia, for it inspired the name of an Iron Maiden album. I really love the titular Brave New World song. I did read Brave New World while listening to that song. Yeah, classic dystopia isn't that bad, it's just way too grotesque for me now. Yes, the news suck. Yes, people deserve better, of course. And so, yeah, there's going to be a video about fantasy versus dystopia and why fantasy works and dystopia not so much. I need to script that video. Alright, that's all. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Maybe you would agree with my take. I really want to add one thing. I did talk in this video about whether I'd recommend these classic dystopias. And I mentioned that I would recommend reading them at the beginning of your reader journey. Well, that's because they work better at the very beginning. And the reason I'm recommending reading these books early, because they wouldn't be so impressive now. And one more thing that I want to add is that books should be judged by their own merit too. Well, the dystopian fiction almost always is judged by external merit, okay, whatever happens in the world and how it's related to this book. But at the end of the day, it's still fiction, and you still would want fiction that works for you, and you still are going to ask this question: what is left when, if you deprive these books of all the external stuff? What's left of it? And you'd still want a solid book. Yeah, the Hunger Games worked, and the classical dystopias not so much. Alright, that's all. Goodbye. So yeah, fantasy versus dystopia video, yeah, it should be done. Goodbye.